Elena Rodriguez had grown comfortable with invisibility. At 59, she moved through the world like background noise, grocery shopping in faded jeans, tending her small garden outside Colorado Springs, driving her reliable Honda to the library twice a week. 3 years of retirement had softened the sharp edges of military precision that once defined her every movement. The phone call shattered her quiet Tuesday morning like a sonic boom. "Ma'am, this is Captain Williams from Peterson Air Force Base. We have your name in our technical consultant files." The voice was young, urgent. "We need experienced personnel for emergency training exercises with the S-70 tactical transport. Most of our senior staff are deployed overseas." Elena set down her coffee cup, muscle memory straightening her posture. What kind of training? Mountain weather navigation and emergency protocols. The computer shows you logged significant hours on tactical transports during your active duty. Papers rustled in the background. "We're short-staffed, and the training window closes this week due to weather patterns." She hadn't touched aircraft controls in 3 years. Her flight suit still hung in the closet, crisp and untouched, like a museum piece from another life. But something in the captain's voice, desperation masked as routine, made her pause. "When do you need me?" "Tomorrow, 0800 hours. "Ma'am, I should mention ... The voice hesitated. "The crew roster shows mostly junior officers. They might not be familiar with consultants from your ... generation." Elena almost smiled. Generation. Such a polite way of saying old. "I'll be there, Captain." That evening, she pulled the flight suit from its hanger. The fabric felt foreign against her fingers, like greeting an old friend after years of silence. In the mirror, she looked exactly like what she was, a gray-haired woman playing dress-up in clothes that belonged to someone younger, stronger, more relevant. But her hands, weathered and steady, remembered everything. The drive to Peterson Air Force Base took her through familiar terrain. Every mountain peak held memories of navigation exercises, emergency landings, missions she couldn't discuss even in retirement. The base itself looked smaller than she remembered, more modern, filled with faces that wouldn't recognize her name or her accomplishments. At the security checkpoint, the young guard scrutinized her ID with barely concealed confusion. "Ma'am, you're here for flight training?" "Technical consultation," she corrected, though the distinction felt meaningless. Walking across the tarmac toward the massive S-70, Elena felt the weight of curious stares. Ground crew members paused their work to watch the gray-haired woman in the outdated flight suit. Their expressions ranged from polite confusion to barely hidden amusement. The S-70 tactical transport dominated the runway like a sleeping giant. Elena had flown similar aircraft hundreds of times, but seeing one again after 3 years of civilian life made her heart race with something between excitement and terror. The aircraft represented everything she had been and everything she was no longer. Inside the briefing room, 5 officers sat around a metal table covered with weather reports and flight charts. The conversation died when she entered. "Gentlemen, this is your technical consultant," Captain Williams announced. "Elena Rodriguez, former Air Force technical officer." Former. The word hung in the air like exhaust fumes. Colonel Marcus Lorne, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with the confident swagger of someone who'd never met a challenge he couldn't overcome, looked up from his coffee with undisguised skepticism. His eyes traveled from Elena's gray hair to her civilian sneakers, cataloging everything that marked her as an outsider. "Technical officer," he repeated slowly, like testing the words for believability. "What kind of aircraft did you work on?" "Various tactical transports, some cargo, some ... Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. "Some classified missions." Lieutenant Ryan Foster, the designated pilot for tomorrow's training exercise, exchanged a glance with his co-pilot. At 32, Ryan had the kind of polished confidence that came from textbook knowledge and coastal flying experience. Mountain weather was theoretical to him, something studied, but never truly encountered. "Well," Colonel Lawrence said, his voice carrying just enough condescension to sting, "we appreciate the consultation. You'll be observing from the passenger section during the exercise. Standard protocol for civilian advisors." Elena nodded without protest, but something cold settled in her stomach. Observer, passenger, civilian advisor. Each term another way of saying she didn't belong in the cockpit where she'd spent the most meaningful years of her life. As the briefing continued, she noticed how the younger officers deferred to Colonel Lawrence's every word, how they treated the upcoming mountain weather exercise like a routine training flight. None of them had the weathered look of pilots who'd faced truly dangerous conditions. Their confidence was pristine, untested. When the meeting ended, Elena lingered near the weather reports, studying barometric pressure readings and wind patterns. With the intensity of someone reading a thriller novel, something felt wrong about the projections. The numbers were too clean, too predictable for Colorado mountain weather. "Mom?" Captain Williams approached hesitantly. "The crew transport leaves at 0730 tomorrow. Make sure you're here early." As she drove home, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow's routine training exercise was going to be anything but routine. The younger officers saw clear skies and manageable conditions. But after decades of reading mountain weather, she saw the subtle signs of a storm system that meteorologists had either missed or underestimated. That night, she sat in her kitchen, staring at her old flight logbook. Page after page of entries, documenting missions that officially never happened. Flights through conditions that should have been impossible. Moments when split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. Tomorrow, she would be a passenger, an observer, a relic from a forgotten era. But Elena Rodriguez had survived too much to let arrogance and inexperience endanger lives, even if those lives belonged to people who saw her as irrelevant. The storm was coming, whether they believed it or not. The crew assembly area buzzed with the casual energy of men who believed they were about to complete another routine training exercise. Elena arrived 15 minutes early, her flight suit pressed and her small logbook tucked under her arm, a habit from decades of meticulous record-keeping that she couldn't abandon even in retirement. Lieutenant Ryan Foster stood near the coffee station, gesticulating wildly as he described his weekend aerobatic practice to a group of younger officers. His confidence filled the room like cologne, pleasant enough in small doses, overwhelming in excess. "Mountain flying is all about reading the terrain," Ryan was saying. "Once you understand the physics, it's actually easier than coastal navigation. Less traffic, clearer sightlines." Elena poured herself coffee and said nothing, though every instinct screamed that Ryan's understanding of mountain weather was dangerously superficial. Mountain conditions could shift from manageable to deadly in minutes, and the morning weather reports still showed inconsistencies that made her deeply uneasy. Colonel Lorne burst through the briefing room doors with the dramatic flair of someone who enjoyed making entrances. His eyes immediately found Elena, and his expression shifted into something between amusement and irritation. "Well, well," he announced to the room, his voice carrying clearly. "Looks like we've got our technical advisor suited up and ready to fly." The emphasis on technical advisor made it sound like a joke. "Rodriguez, you planning to take the stick today? Show these young pilots how it was done back in the day." Scattered laughter rippled through the assembled crew. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her expression neutral. She'd faced worse than mockery during her active duty years, sexism disguised as humor, dismissal wrapped in false courtesy. "I'm here to observe," she replied evenly. "Smart choice," Colonel Lorne continued, clearly enjoying his audience. Wouldn't want you to throw out your back trying to reach the controls. These new aircraft are a lot more complex than whatever you flew during your career. More laughter. Elena noticed that Captain Williams, who had called her in the first place, looked uncomfortable with the colonel's comments, but said nothing. The unspoken hierarchy was clear. Challenging Lauren's authority wasn't worth the career consequences. Technical Sergeant David Kim, a communications specialist who couldn't have been older than 25, leaned toward his neighbor and whispered loudly enough for Elena to hear, "My grandmother has the same flight suit. Probably bought it at the same Army surplus store." The comment hit harder than Colonel Lauren's obvious power play. Elena had earned her flight suit through years of training, dangerous missions, and accomplishments that these men couldn't imagine. But to them, she was just another old woman playing dress-up. As they walked toward the A70, Elena fell naturally into step behind the group, invisible and dismissed. She used the opportunity to study each crew member, cataloging their experience, levels, and apparent competencies. Ryan Foster moved with the loose-limbed confidence of someone who'd never encountered a situation he couldn't handle. His co-pilot, Lieutenant James Parker, was barely out of flight school, still carrying himself with the rigid posture of someone trying to prove he belonged. The aircraft ground crew was completing final checks when they arrived. Elena automatically scanned the weather monitoring equipment, noting wind direction indicators and pressure readings that didn't match the morning briefing. The conditions were deteriorating faster than predicted, but the changes were subtle, the kind of details that inexperienced eyes would miss. "Ma'am," a young crew chief approached Elena with barely concealed confusion. "I need to show you to the passenger observation area." The observation area consisted of 4 seats in the rear cargo section, behind a metal partition that separated passengers from the cockpit. Elena had spent her career in pilot seats, navigator positions, and technical stations. Being relegated to the passenger section felt like being locked out of her own house. As the engines began their startup sequence, she heard Colonel Lauren's voice carrying from the cockpit. "At least we won't have to worry about backseat driving from our technical advisor. Pretty sure she can't even see the instruments from back." There. More laughter. Elena strapped herself in and opened her logbook, beginning the detailed observations that had become second nature during her flying career. Engine sounds, vibration patterns, instrument readings visible through the cockpit doorway, everything that might matter when conditions became challenging. The A-70 taxied toward the runway with Ryan Foster at the controls. Through the small window, Elena could see the weather conditions continuing to deteriorate. Cloud formations that had looked manageable an hour ago were now showing the telltale signs of developing instability. She considered saying something, then stopped herself. These men had made it clear that her input wasn't welcome. Warning them about potential weather issues would only invite more mockery, more dismissive comments about overcautious retirees who saw danger everywhere. Instead, she continued taking notes, documenting everything with the precision of someone who understood that details could mean the difference between life and death. As the aircraft lifted off, Colonel Lauren's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning today's training exercise. Our technical advisor in the passenger section can relax and enjoy the ride while the real pilots show how mountain flying is done." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Elena gripped her pen tighter and continued writing, recording altitude changes, engine performance notes, and increasingly concerning weather observations. 20 minutes into the flight, she noticed the first signs of trouble, subtle vibrations in the aircraft frame that suggested they were encountering stronger winds than anticipated. Through the cockpit doorway, she could see Ryan Foster making minor adjustments to maintain course, his movements still confident but requiring more effort than they should have for routine mountain flying. The weather was worsening, exactly as Elena had feared. The storm system that meteorologists had predicted for evening was arriving hours early, bringing with it the kind of dangerous conditions that could overwhelm inexperienced pilots. Elena made another entry in her logbook, noting the time and her growing concerns. Around her, the aircraft began to experience light turbulence, nothing dramatic yet, but a clear indication that the smooth training flight everyone expected was about to become something much more challenging. In the cockpit, she could hear Colonel Lawrence still making jokes, his voice betraying no awareness of the changing conditions. Ryan Foster was focused on his instruments, but his mountain weather experience was limited to textbook scenarios and computer simulations. Elena closed her eyes and listened to the aircraft, feeling its rhythm through the seat, reading the subtle changes in engine tone and airframe stress that spoke louder than any instrument panel. The A-70 was beginning to work harder, fighting against conditions that were rapidly moving beyond routine training parameters. The storm was coming, and the crew that had dismissed her as irrelevant was about to face conditions that would test every skill they possessed and probably exceed them. The first real sign of trouble came as a pressure change that made Elena's ears pop. In the cockpit, warning lights began their urgent symphony: altitude alerts, navigation errors, pressure differentials cascading across the instrument panel like dominoes falling in sequence. Through the narrow cockpit doorway, Elena watched Ryan Foster's confident posture shift into something more rigid, more focused. His hands moved across controls with increasing urgency, making adjustments that should have been routine, but were clearly requiring more effort than expected. The A-70 began to shudder violently as they climbed past 15,000 feet. What had started as minor turbulence was rapidly becoming something far more dangerous. Elena felt the familiar knot of dread in her stomach, the same feeling she'd experienced years ago when routine missions turned into survival situations. Altitude warning. Lieutenant Parker's voice crackled over the intercom, no longer casual. We're getting some unusual pressure readings. Colonel Lorne's response carried the forced calm of someone trying to maintain authority in an increasingly uncontrollable situation. Nothing we haven't handled before. Foster, adjust our heading to avoid the worst of this turbulence. But Elena could see what the cockpit crew was missing. This wasn't ordinary turbulence. It was a pressure system collapse, the kind of weather event that could tear aircraft apart if not handled properly. The storm front that meteorologists had predicted for late evening had arrived with the fury of a compressed spring, bringing with it wind shears and pressure differentials that could overwhelm even experienced pilots. Ryan Foster made a series of manual adjustments, overriding the aircraft's automatic systems with the kind of aggressive control inputs that Elena recognized as panic, disguised as expertise. Each adjustment fought against the aircraft's natural stability, creating a feedback loop that was making the situation worse rather than better. We need to reduce throttle and adjust auxiliary controls, Elena called out, her voice cutting through the growing chaos. The pressure differential is, I don't need flight advice from the passenger section. Ryan snapped back, his voice tight with stress and wounded pride. I've got this under control. Elena fell silent, settling back into her seat with the terrible understanding that pride was about to endanger everyone aboard. She'd seen this exact scenario play out before, competent pilots undone by their refusal to acknowledge situations beyond their experience level. The aircraft pitched violently to the left, throwing everyone against their restraints. Warning alarms filled the cabin with their urgent shrieking, and Elena could see multiple instrument failures cascading across the cockpit displays. The navigation system flickered and went dark. Backup power systems kicked in, but half the critical instruments remained dead. Ryan Foster's face had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead as G-forces hit him harder than anything he'd experienced in training. The sudden pressure changes were making him lightheaded, and Elena watched with growing horror as his head began to loll forward toward the control panel. For a terrifying moment, no one was flying the plane. The S-70 was flying blind in the heart of a mountain storm with a crew that had never faced anything like this before. Lieutenant Parker, barely out of flight school, stared at the dead instruments with the wide-eyed panic of someone realizing his training had never covered scenarios this extreme. Someone take control. Colonel Lorne's voice cracked with barely contained panic, all his earlier arrogance replaced by desperate fear. But there was no one to take control. Technical Sergeant Kim was a communications specialist, not a pilot. The other crew members were cargo and systems technicians, trained for equipment maintenance, not emergency flying. Elena unbuckled her restraints and stood up, her voice cutting through the chaos with quiet authority. Put me in the pilot's seat. The cockpit fell silent except for the screaming of warning alarms and the violent shuddering of the aircraft fighting against conditions it wasn't designed to handle. Who do you think you are? Technical Sergeant Kim shouted, his voice shrill with fear and disbelief. Elena's response was steady, each word delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had faced death before and survived. I'm the only person on this aircraft who has ever landed in zero visibility with no ground control and half the instruments dead. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Everyone in that cockpit was doing the same desperate calculation. Their chances with an untested old woman versus their chances with no pilot at all. Colonel Lorne, his face ashen and his earlier swagger completely evaporated, stepped aside from the pilot's seat without another word. Elena slipped into the pilot's seat like coming home after a long journey. Her hands found the controls with muscle memory that 3 years of retirement hadn't dulled, fingers automatically adjusting to the familiar weight and resistance of aircraft systems under stress. The first thing she did was reduce the main throttle by 15%, a counterintuitive move that confused everyone watching. In crisis situations, most pilots' instinct was to fight harder, push more power, force the aircraft to comply. But Elena understood that sometimes survival meant working with the chaos rather than against it. Why are you slowing down, Colonel? Lorne demanded, his voice tight with fear. Elena didn't answer immediately. She was listening to the aircraft, feeling its rhythm through the control stick, reading the story that vibrations and sounds told about structural stress, wind patterns, and the invisible forces trying to tear them apart. Her fingers danced across switches and dials with surgical precision, each movement deliberate and confident. She adjusted the auxiliary wing controls to regain flight stability, a technique that most pilots never mastered because it required flying by instinct rather than instruments. The radar began flickering back to life, section by section. Elena was flying partially blind, using light angles through the windscreen to judge position, determining wind direction from the vibrations in the control stick. It was old school. Aviation at its most dangerous and most beautiful, the kind of flying that couldn't be taught in simulators or learned from textbooks. As she worked, she whispered the mantra her old instructor had drilled into her decades ago. The aircraft doesn't save people. The person controlling it saves everyone on board. Through the chaos, Elena began to understand the storm's pattern, reading its rhythm like a piece of complex music. Where Ryan had fought against the weather, she began to dance with it, using the wind currents to stabilize the aircraft instead of battling them directly. Lieutenant Parker, his voice filled with awe and growing hope, asked quietly, "How did you learn to fly like this?" Elena remained focused on the controls, but her silence spoke volumes. Around the cockpit, pieces began clicking into place for the crew members who were finally paying attention to details they'd missed earlier. The way she instinctively knew which controls to adjust without looking. The calm precision with which she read conditions that had overwhelmed their instruments. the quiet confidence of someone who had survived situations that existed beyond the boundaries of normal training. As the A-70 began to stabilize under Elena's control, Colonel Lorne asked the question that everyone was thinking. Who are you? Really? Elena's hands never left the controls, but for the first time since taking the pilot's seat, she allowed herself a small smile. Someone who's been underestimated before. The revelation came in whispers, passed between crew members as Elena continued to guide the A-70 through conditions that should have been impossible to navigate. Technical Sergeant Kim was the first to connect the pieces, his voice barely audible. Over the storm, Rodriguez. Elena Rodriguez. His face went pale as memory surfaced. Holy hell, you're Carter's student. The name hit the cockpit like a physical force. Captain James Carter, the ghost pilot. Every military aviator knew the legend, even if most of the details remained classified. Carter had trained only a handful of pilots in his advanced techniques before disappearing on a classified mission over hostile territory 15 years ago. His students were legendary in aviation circles, known for their ability to fly in impossible conditions, to land aircraft that should have crashed, to navigate by instinct when all instruments failed. They were called ghost pilots, themselves aviators who could make aircraft perform beyond their design specifications through pure skill and intuition. The ghost pilot only trained 4 people, Lieutenant Parker whispered, replacing his earlier skepticism. They said his last student was a woman, but she disappeared from public records after some classified mission in Afghanistan. Elena said nothing, her attention focused on threading the A-70 through wind currents that would have destroyed a less skilled pilot's attempt at control. But her silence confirmed everything the crew was beginning to understand. Colonel Lorne, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated, stared at Elena with new comprehension. The Kandahar landing, that was you. It had been a legend whispered in pilot training programs for over a decade. An unnamed pilot who had landed a damaged transport aircraft in the middle of a sandstorm with no cockpit visibility, no ground control, and half the crew unconscious from smoke inhalation. 43 lives saved through skill that bordered on the supernatural. She's been sitting in the passenger section this whole time, Ryan Foster said quietly, his voice thick with shame and growing realization of how close they'd come to disaster. We've been making jokes about someone who ... He couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of their dismissal, their mockery, their assumption that Elena was just another retiree playing dress-up, crashed down on all of them simultaneously. Elena continued her methodical work, bringing the A-70 under increasingly stable control. Through the storm, she was navigating using landmarks that existed only in her memory: mountain peaks, valley configurations, wind patterns that she'd studied and memorized during countless training flights in similar conditions. "Ma'am," Captain Williams' voice came over the radio from base control, static-filled but urgent. "We're showing severe weather conditions in your sector. Multiple aircraft have been grounded. What's your status?" Elena keyed the radio with one hand while maintaining control with the other. "This is Rodriguez. Aircraft stable, navigating by visual reference. Estimate arrival in 45 minutes. The radio crackled with shocked silence. Every controller at Peterson Air Force Base knew that visual navigation in current conditions should have been impossible. Other aircraft with more experienced crews had been forced to ground rather than attempt flying in the storm system that was now battering the Colorado mountains. As Elena guided them through the worst of the weather, she began sharing fragments of knowledge that no textbook could teach. "Feel the pressure through the stick," she told Ryan, who was watching her every movement with intense concentration. "The aircraft will tell you what the weather is doing before your instruments can process it." She showed him how to read wind shear through subtle changes in engine tone, how to anticipate pressure drops by watching cloud formations through the windscreen, how to use the aircraft's natural stability instead of fighting against it. "This is what Carter taught you," Lieutenant Parker said. No longer a question, but a statement of newfound respect. "Captain Carter taught me that aircraft want to fly," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the continuing turbulence. "Most pilots spend their careers fighting their own equipment. He showed us how to work with the machine instead of against it." The storm began to clear as they approached familiar terrain, but Elena's navigation remained flawless despite visibility. That would have challenged pilots with decades of mountain flying experience. She was reading the landscape through instinct, developed over thousands of hours in similar conditions. "Base control, this is Rodriguez requesting landing clearance." "Rodriguez, visibility is near zero. All other aircraft are holding pattern until conditions improve." Elena keyed the radio again, her voice carrying quiet confidence. "Base control, I have visual on the runway." Through the windscreen, none of the crew could see anything but swirling clouds and rain. But Elena was flying by references that existed. Beyond normal site pressure changes, wind patterns, the subtle pull of terrain that drew the aircraft towards safe landing zones. The touchdown was so smooth that some crew members didn't realize they had landed until they felt the engines powering down. Elena had brought the massive A-70 down through conditions that had grounded every other aircraft on the base, making it look effortless. As the cockpit door opened and ground crew rushed to meet them, Elena stood up slowly, removed her gloves, and made her first official announcement since taking control of the aircraft. Training exercise complete. She walked past the stunned faces of her crewmates, past the ground personnel who were already buzzing with questions about how they had managed to land in such conditions. Elena said nothing more. Her flying had done all the talking necessary. Behind her, the crew remained in the cockpit, staring at the pilot's seat where she had performed what could only be described as a miracle of aviation. The instruments were still flickering, the weather was still dangerous, and they all knew with absolute certainty that without Elena Rodriguez, they would not have survived the day. Colonel Lorne was the first to break the silence. "We treated her like ... He couldn't finish the sentence. "Like she was nobody," Ryan Foster completed, his voice hollow with shame. Technical Sergeant Kim pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking, as he scrolled through military aviation databases. "Look at this," he said quietly. "Elena Rodriguez, classified missions from 2010 to 2018. Commendations for extraordinary airmanship under combat conditions. Training certification from Captain James Carter, Advanced Weather Navigation and Emergency Protocols." The records were heavily redacted, but enough remained visible to paint a picture of a pilot whose skills had been tested in situations that most aviators would never face. Missions flown in conditions that existed beyond the boundaries of normal. Training. Aircraft landed in circumstances that should have resulted in total loss. "She saved our lives," Lieutenant Parker said quietly. "And before today, we didn't even know her name." Outside the aircraft, Elena walked across the tarmac through the continuing storm, her flight suit buffeted by winds that were still grounding other aircraft. To anyone watching, she looked like exactly what she had always been, a gray-haired woman in an outdated uniform, unremarkable and easily overlooked. But the 5 men she left behind in the cockpit now understood the truth. They had spent the morning mocking a legend, dismissing someone whose skills exceeded anything they had imagined possible. The old woman they had treated as irrelevant had just reminded them why respect is earned, not given, and why experience trumps arrogance every single time. Within 2 hours of landing, the story had spread through Peterson Air Force Base like electricity through copper wire. Ground crew members who had witnessed the impossible landing told maintenance technicians. Communications specialists shared the story with operations personnel. By evening, Everyone on base knew about the gray-haired woman who had saved 5 crew members in conditions that had grounded every other aircraft. The transformation was immediate and profound. Officers who had snickered at Elena's appearance that morning now approached her with genuine respect. The maintenance crew wanted to hear her technical insights about aircraft performance under extreme stress. Young pilots requested informal mentoring sessions, hoping to learn even fragments of the skills that had made the difference between life and death. Captain Williams found Elena in the base cafeteria, sitting alone with a cup of coffee and her ever-present logbook. The noise level dropped noticeably when he approached her table. Word had traveled fast, and everyone wanted to hear whatever conversation was about to take place. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet cafeteria. "When I called you for technical consultation, I had no idea who you really were." Elena looked up from her notes, her expression neutral. "You called the right person for the job. That's what matters." "No, ma'am, that's not what matters." Williams pulled out a chair and sat down without invitation, his voice growing more intense. "What matters is that we almost got 5 people killed because we were too arrogant to recognize expertise when it was sitting right in front of us." Around the cafeteria, conversations had stopped entirely. Everyone was listening to what felt like a moment of reckoning, a public acknowledgement of assumptions that could have proven fatal. Colonel Lorne appeared at Elena's table, his earlier swagger replaced by something approaching humility. In his hands, he carried a folder thick with official documents. "Rodriguez, I'm submitting a formal recommendation for you to be appointed as an honorary flight instructor in advanced weather navigation techniques." He set the folder on the table. "My report details not just your technical skills, but your composure under pressure and your ability to perform when everyone else had given up." Elena glanced at the folder but didn't open it. "I'm retired, Colonel. Retirement doesn't erase what you accomplished today." Lauren's voice carried a weight that hadn't been there that morning. "Or what you've accomplished throughout your career. We need instructors who can teach skills that can't be learned from textbooks." The recommendation letter, Elena would later discover, was unlike anything Lorne had written before. It detailed not just the technical aspects of her flying, but the leadership she had demonstrated in crisis situations, her ability to remain calm when experienced pilots panicked, her willingness to take control when others froze. More importantly, it acknowledged the institutional failure that had nearly led to disaster. The assumption that age meant irrelevance, the dismissal of expertise based on appearance, the dangerous arrogance that had prevented the crew from recognizing Elena's qualifications until their lives depended on them. Technical Sergeant Kim approached Elena's table with obvious nervousness, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "Ma'am, I found this in storage," he said quietly, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "It belonged to Captain Carter. I think he would want you to have it." He unwrapped a tarnished flight badge, Carter's personal insignia from his days as an active pilot. Elena accepted it without words, but those who knew her could see the emotion in her eyes. It represented not just recognition of her skills, but acknowledgement of the legacy she carried and the respect she had finally earned. The base's technical department hung a wooden plaque outside the main briefing room that afternoon. "Rodriguez Control Room, where the forgotten returned to lead." It became a symbol of respect that had been overdue for far too long. But the most meaningful transformation came from the crew members who had shared the flight. Ryan Foster, the pilot whose pride had nearly killed them all, became Elena's most dedicated student. He appeared at her temporary office every day, asking questions about weather navigation, emergency protocols, and the intuitive flying techniques that couldn't be learned in simulators. "How do you read wind patterns through the controls?" he asked during one session, his notebook filled with detailed observations. "Stop trying to control everything," Elena replied. Listen to what the aircraft is telling you. Most pilots spend their careers talking to their equipment instead of having conversations with it. Lieutenant Parker, the co-pilot who had barely spoken during the crisis, brought Elena weather reports and navigation charts, asking her to explain the subtle signs that she had recognized when their instruments failed. The pressure readings were wrong that morning, she explained, pointing to the meteorological data. But everyone was reading numbers instead of understanding what those numbers meant in context of mountain weather patterns. Even Technical Sergeant Kim, who had made jokes about Elena's appearance, became a convert. He started researching Elena's career, uncovering fragments of her service record that painted a picture of someone whose contributions to military aviation had been systematically overlooked. "Ma'am, why didn't anyone know who you were?" he asked during one of their conversations. Elena was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. Because the important work often gets done by people who don't seek credit for it. Captain Carter taught me that the best pilots are usually the ones nobody talks about. The story spread beyond Peterson Air Force Base through social media and military networks. A photograph taken by base security cameras captured the moment perfectly. Elena, at the controls, her eyes focused and calm amid a cockpit full of flashing warning lights and panicked faces. The image was shared thousands of times across military social networks and internal forums. Below the photograph, a single comment appeared that captured everything. She didn't just control the aircraft. She controlled our faith in what's possible. But Elena remained characteristically modest about the attention. When reporters called requesting interviews, she declined. When military publications wanted to feature her story, she referred them to the official incident reports. The aircraft performed exactly as designed, she told anyone who asked. The crew did their jobs. That's what happened. What she didn't mention was the deeper truth that everyone on base was beginning to understand. Experience couldn't be faked. Expertise couldn't be dismissed just because it came in an unexpected package. And sometimes, the person you most need is the one you least expect to save you. The base established an informal tradition that week. Before every difficult training mission, crew members would walk past Elena's photograph in the hallway. It served as a reminder that expertise could come from unexpected places. And that wisdom often wore the face of someone you might otherwise overlook. Elena returned to her quiet retirement, but she was no longer forgotten. Young pilots sought her advice. Commanders consulted her on weather conditions. And everyone understood that beneath the gray hair and modest demeanor was one of the finest aviators any of them would ever meet. The formal inquiry began 3 days after the flight, convened by Brigadier General Patricia Hayes, the base commander who had been notified of the incident through official channels. The conference room held the 5 crew members, Elena, and a panel of senior officers who represented everything from flight safety to personnel management. General Hayes, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that filled rooms, began with a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Colonel Lorne, explain to me how a retired technical officer ended up piloting in a 70 through conditions that grounded every other aircraft on this base." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Colonel Lorne, stripped of his usual swagger, looked like a man facing the consequences of decisions he couldn't undo. "Ma'am, the crew encountered severe weather conditions beyond the scope of normal training parameters. Our primary pilot became incapacitated due to pressure changes, and Rodriguez volunteered to take control." "Volunteered," General Hayes repeated, her voice carrying skeptical emphasis. According to the preliminary reports, Rodriguez was serving as a technical consultant relegated to the passenger section. Why wasn't she in the cockpit from the beginning? Elena watched the exchange with the calm detachment of someone who had anticipated this moment. She had seen enough military inquiries to know that truth would emerge regardless of anyone's desire to manage or control the narrative. Captain Williams, who had made the original call requesting Elena's consultation, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "General, when I reviewed Rodriguez's file, it showed technical officer certification and tactical transport experience. The classified portions of her record weren't accessible through normal channels. So you assigned someone with classified flight credentials to passenger observation?" General Hayes' voice could have cut steel. "Without investigating her actual qualifications?" The truth was becoming inescapably clear. Elena's service record had been compartmentalized for security reasons, but basic due diligence would have revealed her advanced pilot certifications. Instead, assumptions based on age and appearance had overridden professional protocol. Ryan Foster, the pilot whose pride had nearly killed them all, finally found his voice. "General Hayes, I need to state for the record that Rodriguez saved our lives. My inexperience with mountain weather conditions created a crisis situation that I couldn't handle." It was a remarkable admission from someone whose career could be damaged by acknowledging incompetence. But Foster had spent 3 days replaying the flight, understanding how close they had come to disaster, and recognizing that Elena's intervention was the only reason he was alive to face this inquiry. General Hayes turned her attention to Elena, her expression shifting from stern to respectful. "Rodriguez, I've reviewed what portions of your service record are available to me. Would you care to explain why you didn't assert your qualifications when you recognized dangerous weather developing?" Elena had been waiting for this question. Her answer was measured, thoughtful, and devastating in its simplicity. "General, I was specifically told that my role was technical consultation and passenger observation. When I attempted to provide weather navigation input during the crisis, I was told that flight advice from the passenger section wasn't needed. The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in that room understood the implications. Elena had recognized the danger, tried to warn the crew, and been dismissed because of assumptions about her relevance and competence. "Let me understand this clearly," General Hayes continued. "You had advanced knowledge that weather conditions were deteriorating beyond safe parameters. You attempted to communicate this to the flight crew, and you were ignored?" "Yes, ma'am." Technical Sergeant Kim, who had made jokes about Elena's flight suit, looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. The weight of their collective dismissal was becoming impossible to bear. General Hayes opened a thick folder that had been sitting closed throughout the inquiry. "Rodriguez, I've received special clearance to review portions of your classified service record. Would you prefer to discuss your background privately, or are you comfortable sharing relevant details with this panel?" Elena glanced around the room at the faces of men who had learned hard lessons about assumptions and respect. "I'm comfortable sharing what's necessary for this inquiry, General. Captain James Carter trained you in advanced weather navigation and emergency flight protocols from 2015 to 2017. "Yes, ma'am." "You completed 43 classified missions between 2010 and 2018. Including multiple aircraft recoveries under combat conditions." "Yes, ma'am." "The Kandahar incident in 2016 involved you landing a damaged transport with 43 personnel aboard during a sandstorm with no ground control and significant aircraft damage." "Yes, ma'am." Each revelation hit the room like a physical blow. The crew members who had dismissed Elena as an irrelevant retiree were learning that they had been in the presence of one of the military's most accomplished pilots, someone whose expertise exceeded anything they had imagined possible. Colonel Lorne finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and barely audible. "General, I take full responsibility for the crew's failure to recognize Rodriguez's qualifications. You take responsibility for nearly getting 5 people killed because you couldn't see past your own assumptions," General Hayes corrected sharply. This incident represents a systemic failure that goes beyond individual mistakes. The general's attention turned back to Elena. "Rodriguez, what would you have done differently if you had been properly consulted from the beginning?" "I would have recommended delaying the training exercise," Elena replied without hesitation. The weather patterns that morning showed clear signs of early storm development. The mission should have been postponed until conditions stabilized. It was a simple statement that revealed the magnitude of what had gone wrong. An experienced pilot reviewing the same data that everyone else had access to would have recognized the danger and prevented the crisis entirely. Instead, General Hayes continued, "You were placed in passenger observation while inexperienced. Crew members proceeded with a mission that should never have been authorized." The implications extended far beyond this single incident. How many other qualified personnel were being overlooked because of assumptions about age, gender, or appearance? How many crises could be prevented by properly utilizing available expertise, instead of dismissing it based on superficial judgments? Lieutenant Parker, who had been silent throughout most of the inquiry, finally spoke up. "General, I need to ask Rodriguez something directly." General Hayes nodded permission. "Ma'am, when you realized we were in serious trouble, why didn't you just take control earlier? You could have prevented the whole crisis." Elena's answer revealed the depth of professionalism that had guided her actions throughout the incident. "Lieutenant, taking control of an aircraft without authorization, even in an emergency, would have been a serious breach of protocol. I waited until I was specifically requested to intervene." Even facing life-threatening danger, Elena had followed proper chain of command procedures. She had waited for official authorization before acting, despite knowing the delay increased risk for everyone aboard. The inquiry continued for 2 more hours, establishing a timeline of events that painted a clear picture of institutional failure. Qualified expertise had been available but ignored. Warning signs had been recognized but dismissed. Pride and assumptions had nearly resulted in tragedy. When General Hayes finally closed the official record, her concluding statement was brief but comprehensive. "This incident will result in immediate changes to personnel consultation protocols. All technical advisors will be properly credentialed, and their qualifications thoroughly reviewed before mission assignment. Additionally, mandatory training will be implemented to address unconscious bias in crew selection and consultation procedures." She paused, looking directly at Elena. "Rodriguez, the Air Force owes you an apology. Your service record speaks to dedication and expertise that should have been recognized and respected from the moment you stepped onto this base." Elena nodded but said nothing. Apologies were useful, but systemic change was what mattered. As the inquiry concluded and participants filed out of the conference room, Elena remained seated, making final notes in her logbook. The habit of documenting everything had served her well throughout her career. Today's inquiry was simply another entry in a lifetime of careful observation and precise record-keeping. Ryan Foster approached her as she closed the logbook. "Ma'am, I want you to know that I'll be recommending policy changes based on what we learned today. This can't happen again." Elena looked up at the young pilot, whose arrogance had nearly killed them both. What she saw now was different, someone who had faced his own limitations and emerged humbled but determined to grow. Foster, the best. Pilots are the ones who learn from their mistakes and make sure others don't repeat them. It was forgiveness wrapped in professional guidance, acknowledgement that growth was possible, even after near-catastrophic failure. The reckoning was complete. Truth had emerged, responsibility had been acknowledged, and changes would be implemented to prevent similar incidents. But for Elena, the most important outcome wasn't institutional reform or public recognition. It was the knowledge that 5 lives had been saved, and that her skills dismissed and overlooked for too long had finally been recognized for what they truly were: 2 weeks after the inquiry, Elena received an unexpected visitor at her small house outside Colorado Springs. Brigadier General Hayes stood on her front porch in civilian clothes, holding a leather portfolio and wearing an expression that mixed official business with personal respect. "Rodriguez, I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit. There are some matters that need to be discussed outside official channels." Elena invited her in, offering coffee while wondering what could bring a base commander to her retirement home. The living room, with its modest furniture and aviation books lining the walls, felt strangely formal with a general sitting on the worn sofa. "Elena, may I call you Elena?" General Hayes began, setting the portfolio on the coffee table. "What I'm about to share with you involves decisions made at levels above my authority, but I wanted to deliver this personally." She opened the portfolio, revealing documents that Elena recognized as highly classified briefing materials. The kind of paperwork that had defined the most secret portions of her military career. "The Pentagon has been reviewing your service record in light of recent events. Your actions during the A-70 incident triggered a comprehensive evaluation of your contributions to military aviation." Elena remained silent, though she felt her pulse quicken. Classified evaluations rarely led to good news for retired personnel. "Elena, your training under Captain Carter and your subsequent mission record represents some of the most advanced tactical aviation work conducted in the past 15 years. The techniques you developed for flying in hostile conditions have been studied and incorporated into advanced pilot training programs." General Hayes pulled out a photograph that made Elena's breath catch. It showed her in the cockpit of a different aircraft, taken during a mission she couldn't discuss even with a general who held appropriate clearances. The Helmand Province extraction in 2017. 47 personnel evacuated from a hot landing zone during a dust storm that should have made flying impossible. Elena remembered that mission with crystal clarity. Taliban forces closing in, wounded soldiers who would die without immediate evacuation, weather conditions that had grounded every other aircraft in the region. She had flown by instinct alone, using techniques that Captain Carter had taught her about reading wind patterns through sound and vibration, or the supply drop in the Hindu Kush Mountains during the blizzard of 2016, when satellite navigation failed and ground beacons went dark. You completed the mission using dead reckoning and landmark navigation. More memories surfaced. Missions that had saved lives but remained buried in classified files. Accomplishments that had been deemed too sensitive for public recognition. "Elena, the military has a problem," General Hayes continued, her voice becoming more personal. "We have an entire generation of pilots trained on simulators and GPS navigation. They can fly perfectly in ideal conditions, but when technology fails or weather becomes extreme, they lack the fundamental skills that pilots like you take for granted." The admission was remarkable coming from a senior officer. Elena had suspected this for years, watching younger pilots who could execute complex maneuvers, but couldn't read weather patterns or fly by instinct when instruments failed. The Pentagon wants to establish an advanced training program based on the techniques you learned from Captain Carter. Classified methods that have never been formally documented or taught outside of his small group of students. Elena set down her coffee cup, understanding where this conversation was heading. "General, I'm retired. Officially, yes. But Elena, you're the last person alive who learned these techniques directly from Carter. When he disappeared on that mission in Syria, his knowledge died with him, except for what he passed on to you and 3 other pilots." The weight of that responsibility had haunted Elena for years. She was indeed the sole surviving repository of flying techniques that had been developed through decades of dangerous missions and careful experimentation. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" General Hayes pulled out a formal document bearing Pentagon letterhead. "We're asking you to become the chief instructor for a new program, Advanced Weather Navigation and emergency flight operations. You would train select pilots in the techniques that make the difference between life and death when everything else fails. Elena studied the document, recognizing the significance of what was being offered. This wasn't just a job. It was an opportunity to pass on knowledge that could save countless lives. The program would be based at Peterson Air Force Base, but you would have complete autonomy over curriculum and student selection. We're not asking you to conform to existing training protocols. We're asking you to teach what Captain Carter taught you. The offer represented everything Elena had been denied during her active duty career. Recognition of her expertise, authority to train others, respect for the knowledge she had accumulated through years of dangerous missions. Elena, I need to be completely honest with you, General Hayes continued. This program exists because of what happened during the A-70 incident. Your intervention saved 5 lives, but it also revealed how unprepared our pilots are for conditions beyond their textbook training. Elena walked to the window, looking out at the Colorado mountains where she had been flying for decades. The terrain that had tested her skills, challenged her judgment, and ultimately validated her expertise. How many students would I be training? Initially, 12 pilots per cycle. 6-month intensive courses, focusing on situations where normal training isn't sufficient. These would be our best pilots, selected for advanced missions that require capabilities beyond standard certification. Elena turned back to General Hayes, her decision already made, but needing to understand the full scope of what was being offered. I would want input on curriculum design, student evaluation criteria, and mission simulation scenarios. Absolutely. Elena, this program would be yours to build. We're not asking you to teach someone else's methods. We're asking you to institutionalize your own expertise. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. The same military that had overlooked her qualifications and relegated her to passenger observation was now asking her to design and lead an advanced training program. General, I have conditions. Name them. Student selection based purely on aptitude and performance, regardless of age, gender, or appearance. No administrative interference with training methods. And complete discretion over which techniques can be documented versus which must remain experiential. General Hayes smiled for the first time during the conversation. Elena, those conditions tell me we're asking the right person. As Elena signed the documents that would bring her back to active consultation status, she thought about Captain Carter and the lessons he had taught her about flying beyond the boundaries of normal training. The aircraft doesn't save people, she had whispered during the A-70 incident. The person controlling it saves everyone on board. Now she would have the opportunity to teach that principle to a new generation of pilots, ensuring that Captain Carter's legacy and her own hard-won expertise would continue saving lives long after she was gone. The woman who had been dismissed as irrelevant was about to become one of the most important flight instructors in military aviation. But Elena Rodriguez had always known that the sky remembered who belonged there, regardless of what anyone else believed. 6 months later, Elena stood in the same briefing room where she had been dismissed and mocked. But everything had changed. 12 of the military's most promising pilots sat at attention, notebooks open, preparing for the first day of advanced weather navigation and emergency flight operations. The room itself had been transformed. Weather monitoring equipment lined the walls, displaying real-time atmospheric data from across the Colorado mountain region. Flight simulators capable of replicating extreme conditions had been installed in adjacent rooms. But most importantly, a large photograph hung above the main briefing screen, Captain James Carter in his pilot gear, with the inscription, "In memory of those who taught us to fly beyond our limitations." Elena walked to the front of the room. Wearing her flight suit, The same one she had worn 6 months ago when Colonel Lorne had made jokes about morning stretches. But now the suit bore new insignia: Chief Instructor, Advanced Flight Operations. The gray hair that had once marked her as irrelevant now signified experience that couldn't be purchased or simulated. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned respect through action rather than rank. "For the next 6 months, you will learn to fly aircraft in conditions that your previous training never covered. You will discover techniques that cannot be learned from textbooks or replicated in standard simulators." Among the students sat Lieutenant Ryan Foster, the pilot whose pride had nearly killed them all during the A-70 incident. His presence in the program was Elena's decision. She believed that pilots who had faced their own limitations made the best students. "Some of you may be wondering why this program exists," Elena continued. "6 months ago, I was brought to this base as a technical consultant. I was placed in passenger observation while experienced pilots proceeded with a mission that nearly resulted in multiple fatalities." The room was absolutely silent. Every student knew the story, but hearing it from Elena herself carried different weight. The near disaster occurred not because of equipment failure or impossible weather conditions, but because expertise was dismissed based on assumptions about age and appearance, because warning signs were ignored, and because pride prevented acceptance of assistance when it was offered. Elena paused, letting the lesson sink in. This program exists to ensure that never happens again. You are here to learn skills that can save lives when everything else fails. But more importantly, you are here to learn humility. She walked over to a weather monitoring station, pointing to barometric pressure readings and wind speed indicators. Today's conditions show developing instability in the mountain region. Perfect weather for our first exercise. A student raised her hand. Lieutenant Rebecca Torres, one of the few women in the program. "Ma'am, the base has issued weather advisories. Other training flights have been canceled." Elena smiled. "Exactly. You will learn to fly safely in conditions that ground other aircraft. But first, you need to understand the difference between dangerous weather and impossible weather." She led the group outside to where an A-70 tactical transport waited on the tarmac, the same model aircraft that had nearly crashed 6 months earlier. But this time, Elena was in command from the beginning. "Foster, you'll be my co-pilot for today's demonstration," she announced. "Torres, you'll monitor weather systems from the navigator position. The rest of you will observe and document everything." As they climbed aboard, Elena noticed a mixture of excitement and nervousness among her students. They understood they were about to experience something beyond standard training, but they also trusted Elena's expertise in a way that the previous crew had not. The takeoff was smooth, but as they climbed toward the developing weather system, Elena began her real teaching. "Listen to the aircraft," she instructed. "Feel the vibrations through your seat. Hear the changes in engine tone. Your instruments will tell you what has already happened. Your senses will tell you what is about to happen." When they encountered the first turbulence, Elena's response was methodical and calm. Instead of fighting the weather, she showed them how to work with it, using wind currents to maintain stability rather than battling against atmospheric forces. "Foster, take the controls," she instructed as conditions worsened. "Show me what you've learned." Ryan Foster's flying was completely different from 6 months earlier. Gone was the aggressive overconfidence that had nearly killed them. Instead, he demonstrated the careful precision of someone who had learned to respect both his aircraft and the weather. "Better," Elena acknowledged. "Now watch what happens when we encounter real problems." She began shutting down instruments, systematically simulating the kind of cascading failures that had overwhelmed the crew during the original incident. But this time, the students were prepared. They had been trained to fly by instinct when technology failed, to read weather patterns through sound and vibration, to trust their experience rather than panic when instruments went dark. For 2 hours, Elena guided them through exercises that would have been impossible in standard training programs. They practiced emergency landings with limited visibility, navigation using landmark recognition when GPS failed, and coordination techniques for crew members with different experience levels. When they finally landed, the students sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just experienced. They had flown safely through conditions that had grounded other aircraft, but more importantly, they had learned to trust capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. Questions? Elena asked. As they gathered in the debriefing room, Lieutenant Torres raised her hand. Ma'am, how do you read weather patterns that don't show up on instruments? Experience, Elena replied simply. You'll develop those instincts over time, through exposure to conditions that challenge your assumptions about what's possible. Another student asked, why aren't these techniques taught in standard pilot training? Elena was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. Because they can't be learned from textbooks or replicated in simulators. They require trust in your own judgment, acceptance of uncertainty, and willingness to make decisions when you don't have complete information. As the session ended and students filed out, Ryan Foster approached Elena's desk. Ma'am, I want to thank you for including me in this program. After what happened 6 months ago, I didn't think I deserved the opportunity. Elena looked up from her notes. Foster, pilots who have failed and learned from their mistakes make the best instructors. Someday, you'll be teaching these techniques to other students. That evening, Elena drove home through the same Colorado mountains where she had been flying for decades. The woman who had been dismissed as irrelevant was now training the next generation of military aviators in techniques that could save countless lives. On her coffee table sat a letter from the Pentagon, informing her that the Advanced Weather Navigation Program was being expanded to 3 additional bases. Her curriculum would become standard training for all pilots selected for high-risk missions. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. A handwritten note from Technical Sergeant Kim, who had been transferred to another base. Ma'am, I tell everyone about the day I met a real pilot. Thank you for showing us what expertise looks like. Elena smiled as she read the note, remembering the young man who had made jokes about her flight suit. Growth was possible for everyone, even those who started from positions of arrogance and assumption. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Another base commander requesting consultation on emergency flight protocols. Another opportunity to share knowledge that had been hard-won through years of dangerous missions. This is Elena Rodriguez. She answered, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had proven herself beyond doubt. The woman they had laughed at was now the person they called when everything else failed. The gray-haired retiree had become the standard by which other pilots measured their own courage and skill. Elena Rodriguez had never stopped being a pilot. She had simply been waiting for the world to remember that the sky belonged to those who understood it, regardless of what assumptions others might make. The colonel had laughed when she entered the cockpit 6 months ago. Now, commanders across the country were implementing training programs based on her expertise. Sometimes the only thing you need to change the world is one perfect flight, executed when everyone else believes it's impossible. Elena had flown that flight, and the sky would remember forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.